Hey guys, welcome to this tutorial. This is an experimental tutorial, so it's not geared towards production workflows. These are really just more experimental stuff with different softwares, combining them in different ways that may have not been done before. So that's something I like to do in my free time, is just kind of trying to combine different ideas, new technologies with old technologies, new ways of doing things with old ways of doing things. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about in this one. So we're using AI. We're using Blender, using Embergen, Nuke, and a little bit of VR sculpting as well. So that's the kind of topics we're going to cover in this video. And by the way, if you guys want to let me know in the comments below, if you want more experimental stuff like this on this channel, you can let me know. Or if you want it only geared towards like production stuff, you can let me know that as well. Potentially, I'm thinking about opening a secondary YouTube channel just for the sort of experimental stuff. So that's just some of the thought process there. Yeah, so let me know, but this is kind of what we're going to talk about in this video, and we have a number of things going on here. So I'll kind of break this down. It might be kind of a long video, so you can check out the sort of, I guess, the tags on the bottom of the sort of timeline, and you can skip to different parts if you're interested. But yeah, we're going to kind of step through this one part at a time. So the first part I'm actually going to go through is the frame. So how was this frame created? And it was sort of made by accident. I was kind of just playing around with different things. And so I'm going to open up that script and we'll kind of take a look at it. And these are like sandboxes, by the way. So they're going to be kind of messy scripts because they're really just brainstorming. So these are just, this is a little bit more structured here, but you can see this one's just kind of chaotic. So I know that's going to be another comment. Hey, these are kind of crazy scripts and stuff. But when I'm brainstorming, I'm just playing around with ideas. I'm just pushing everything and kind of coming up with ideas. It's not sort of something that's being handed off to people. So I know those are kind of the comments that people might kind of pick up right away. But yeah, so this is kind of how I started here. So I actually started by generating some different AI pictures here. I had a rough idea of a shot that I wanted to do and start to work on. And it was actually completely different than the sort of end result. So it kind of started down a path and then kind of just kind of deviated off of that path. And that's what's kind of fun of doing your own projects. You don't really have set rules of what you can do. So yeah, I mean, you guys can go check out the video on the AI thing, how to do the descriptions and stuff like that. I think I did it maybe 2 months ago or something like that. Go check out that video. But these are great for inspiration because these are all made by, computer and your prompt. So if you have a rough idea, you can get something that's kind of interesting. And so I found this one and I really like this sort of pattern. One way I've started to think about these AI tools when I'm approaching them in terms of concepting a scene is to think in terms of level of detail. So you can think in terms of like giving descriptions that are more wide sort of angle, wide shot. And then you can do descriptions that are more close up, like the materials themselves. So it's a really good way to concept out, basically level of detail. So it's like if you think of a painter and you think of, the landscape, the painter, if he's painting a tree, he'll just paint one leaf and it's a green dot. But if you want to see the leaf up close, that's a different description. So you can get those kind of zoom in to your scene, and that's how you can sort of concept the scene using these tools. So this is the material that I found was interesting. And what I wanted to do was kind of try to recreate this in 3D in Blender. And first off, the first thing you're going to want to know is that this is not physically based rendering. AI tools, like this looks very painterly. There's some parts that look kind of physically rendered, like some kind of reflections that maybe could be kind of realistic. It looks kind of glass-like. But if you were to try to render this in a physically based render, you're not going to be able to recreate this exactly how it is because the AI is kind of mixing, paintings and pictures and all kinds of things. So there are some parts that feel sort of kind of physical, like in terms of like the way the exposure looks. It looks pretty cool. But you see this light here and that doesn't actually cast onto anything. We say a little bit there, but maybe it's not actually casting. So just keep that in mind. The lights are not physically accurate. So if you're going to try to recreate it, it'll probably look a little bit different already from the get-go, which is actually kind of a cool thing to know. So the way I started with this in my mind was to kind of look at this and sort of break down the forms and shapes into basically simple things that I can recreate. So like for example, if you kind of study this picture, you can kind of go in here, and if I take a roto paint, I want to look at what are the simplest forms that I can identify that I can start to recreate. And so if I look at stuff like this, people who are more generalists are already going to kind of know, what this kind of looks like. It looks like the Voronoi sort of cell kind of pattern, and you can see these here. So these are the kind of things that immediately kind of stood out to me. Is like, okay, I know how to create these sort of shapes, and that's where I'm going to start. So I'm kind of breaking this down and looking for these kind of things, and that's immediately the first thing that I saw. There's other things in here, so you can see this is a little bit similar. It's kind of a sort of a grid, but the grid is a little bit warped around the edges, so it's a little bit more organic, but it's still kind of just, if you look at it, it's really just kind of a grid of sort of squares. So that's another thing to pay attention to, and that's kind of how I went about breaking it down. And I was gonna kind of create those texture patterns and displace them from a 3D model once we hop into 3D. So rather than doing these textures in like Blender or Maya, like there are texture editors, some material editors in those softwares, but for example, the one I just kind of pointed out, it might be a little bit difficult to get that sort of warp and stuff like that. So it's easier just to do it in Nuke if you're familiar with Nuke already. So basically I started with a cell noise like this one here. I wanted to create this surface. So I started with a cell noise, and the cell noise, this is a sort of custom node on Nukepedia. I think it's called cell noise on Nukepedia. You can type it in. I'll probably try to link it in the description there just for the people who want it. Cell noise, and then you can basically modify it. It just gives you a bunch of noise patterns that are better than sort of the standard one that's in Nuke. 3D softwares have a lot more noise patterns than Nuke sometimes. If you look at like Cinema 4D and you go look at what noise patterns they have like a ton of noise patterns that they can use. So hopefully Nuke will implement some more in the future, but fortunately somebody's already created a node called this. Maybe it has the information here, but I'll attach in the description. So this is what we get, and we can play with the size here. We can animate it and stuff like that, and we can add contrast if we want to do stuff like that. So that's kind of what we get. This kind of very basic pattern. But what we can do is we can kind of we can add some contrast to it and get something a little bit closer. So if you see, just adding a little bit of contrast, we already get something that's somewhat kind of close. You get these sort of randomness and smaller ones, but it already feels a little bit similar. It's not too far off. So I did that, and I kind of broke it up with another noise pattern. So it's just like a noise and then multiplying it. So a little bit of breakup, and you get these sort of peaks and troughs of different shapes here. And I played around with different variations of this, so that's what all of these are. It's kind of a mess here, but I was just quickly iterating, coming up with ideas in sort of a sandbox type of way here. So here's another one. This is kind of interesting. I didn't use, I don't know if I used this one, but I did a posterize on it, which you can get sort of these like circular illustrative patterns, which is pretty cool because, like I said, I don't think I used it on this project, but it's a pretty cool technique because you can just like animate this, and then you have like these crazy, I don't know, sort of illustrative circles here, and you could totally use this for like a force field or something like that. Whatever you want to use it for. You could use this as a displacement map on a 3D object, so you could actually, create a really cool effect by doing that. So one of the ways I like to think is really like this. It's very simple. I like to think 2D, 3D, 2D, 2D, and then, kind of converting between these spaces over and over. And you're going to see throughout this video how it's a really weird workflow, but it can create some really interesting results because you can go 2D and then you can go 3D again. So you'll see what I mean. This might sound like nonsense right now, but as I progress in the video, you're going to see sort of the sort of concept behind it. So let me just step through a few more of these examples because I think they're kind of interesting. People might find them interesting. So another cell noise, edge detect instead. If we look at the alpha channel, we get something a little bit crazier. and then you could just play around with like inverting it or just playing with the contrast, playing with the levels of those patterns. So this is the pattern I kind of outputted, and you see that this sort of organic pattern with some of these sort of grid things in there. You know, why was I creating this? Again, I was going back to this picture and trying to look at some of the things underneath and maybe just trying to create something similar. And yeah, maybe it's not exact, but it was kind of close or similar. So that's kind of what these patterns are. I created different variations, and like this one is a little bit different, but it's a really cool pattern. And the way that one's created, again, it's just a cell noise, and then doing an edge detect on a different sort of scale. So you can erode these things, and you can get different shapes. And like I said, that would be kind of hard to do if you're just hopping straight into a 3D software. You know, Blender has a pretty good like material editor, but at the same time, you don't have the level of control that you have in Nuke. And if I wanted to warp this, you can do it in here. If I want to animate it, you can do it really quickly in here as well. So it's just my preference to do it that way. So again, here's another one, edge detect, doing the same kind of idea here. This time I used a little bit of a noise pattern off to the side. I hit replace. It's just grabbing the format. So all it's doing is I just want to make sure that these are always in the same format. Probably didn't even need it here, but that's just a little trick. And then I'm using the glass node again from Nukepedia. And this is just a really easy way to distort things. So yeah, we can just kind of warp using one noise like this one to warp another one. So we can kind of mess up the edges a little bit, get them a little bit more organic rather than like a standard circles everywhere. And then we can, you know, just continue down that path. So here's another example, kind of the last one maybe. Yeah, something like that. So that's the way I kind of mentally was breaking these down and trying to sort of reverse engineer those AI renders. Like, can you recreate those? And I did a bunch of different techniques here. You know, here's another one. It's basically just different cell noises in different sizes, and you can stencil them from each other. You know, for example, I created a cell noise here, just added a bunch of contrast like this, and then just use that to mask the other one. So then you get like shards. And then that's something you could, you know, you could animate both of those and you could create a crazy force field type of thing. Whatever you want to do, it's kind of cool. So I don't want to go on too long in this part of the tutorial, but here's some more shapes just to show you like the amount of variation that you can do. And you can do this pretty quickly. So it's not something that's going to take, you know, hours and hours. So even if you don't use some of them, it's totally okay. So that's kind of the idea. Breaking it down. So that's the sort of 2D part, just getting some textures that we're going to bring into Blender after. And I guess we'll hop into the Blender part next. So the next part of creating this frame is actually creating a render from all of these pieces. So I'll open up the Blender scene. I'll show you what I did with all these textures and yeah, how we go from there. All right, so onto the Blender part. This is the kind of Blender scene that creates the frame. And you might be wondering why it's in a stacked sort of pattern here. And so if we look back at the kind of concept we had, which is this sort of AI thing, you can see it's in kind of multiple layers. We have like a top layer that's kind of glass, and then we have like sort of orange lines on the peaks of the glass. And then we have underneath a bunch of, you know, kind of star shapes and red stuff, kind of red lights underneath, so it's kind of subdermal. So the way I came up and kind of conceptualized it was something like this, where we have multiple layers of textures being displaced. And some of these are on multiple different layers that we can't see because this is not rendered yet. So we see there's one layer here, and if I click, there's actually two right on top of each other, and that creates the kind of gold leaves on the edges. So if I just render this out, I'll show you guys what it looks like. So we'll just switch this to cycles. We'll give it a few seconds here to load, and it'll give us kind of a preview. So this will take a few seconds. And one important thing to note is that our angle is going to matter a lot with the lighting because it's so reflective. So this is kind of what the base looks like. We have some red lights underneath, some reflecting underneath, kind of hitting stuff. And we have the kind of surface reflections hitting the sides here. So I kind of like the way that this looked. But if we kind of rotate and put our camera a little bit lower, we're going to get a little bit more of that Fresnel effect where we get more surface reflections. It's going to look a little bit closer to our concept where we have those kind of glancing angle reflections and stuff underneath. So like I said, the other one's not physically accurate. This is more physically accurate. So I like the way this looked. I thought this result was pretty good. And yeah, I'll just kind of rotate to some different angles here. So you can use this for many different things. Like different angles can be used for sort of different things here, I suppose. So if I run it from the top, it looks a bit different. So where this project sort of deviated, I suppose, is kind of what I was doing was kind of playing around with rotating it here and placing the camera on the side. So I have these like orbs in here that are just emissive lights that kind of reflect. So if I place the camera in here and give it a few seconds to render, we can see we get a really different result. So we can see something kind of interesting here. Maybe the edges and the faceting doesn't hold up quite as much on the metal that's really close to the camera, but some interesting shapes and forms being created. It's not the highest quality render from this perspective, but I actually did use this angle for something. So I'll show you guys what we do in Nuke with this angle. And I kind of rendered a camera zooming through the kind of the layers here. And that's actually how part of the frame was created. So I'll show you guys kind of the end result of that in just a second here. So yeah, these are just basically surfaces with those textures I created in Nuke displaced, and then some shaders on there as well to break up the highlights. I'm not going to go into too much detail on the displacements and every single material. If you guys want like a mini class on that, maybe I'll do one. Just depends if people actually are looking for that kind of thing. You can let me know. But yeah, that's kind of how we get to this point. So we'll hop back into Nuke here and take a look at the sort of 2D side again. So essentially, this is the render we get. And let me just find the animated one. I have an animated one here. So essentially what I did was I took this scene and I pushed the camera through. So I'll just let it play a few frames. We see there's some noise and stuff. We could have done some more samples, but I was just testing different angles and testing different renders. So I just let it render for maybe like an hour or 2 hours or whatever, get a few frames and just see like what angles are kind of interesting. And so this is kind of cool. There's some stuff that looks broken though. And I was like, it's not that good of a render. Maybe the top view is better. I kind of like the way the glass looks though, when you kind of zoom in and you see all the bending of light and you see all the layers. That stuff is kind of interesting. So I was kind of looking at this like, well, maybe I could salvage this render and do something with it. And that's kind of where, like I said, the sort of project takes a little bit of a left turn in terms of what it was going to be. But let's go back into the 2D part now. So again, we talked 2D, 3D, and now we're back in 2D again. And what I decided to do was kind of cut this render up into pieces. So I'm going to go up here into this kind of mess of a script and just kind of step through and just show the kind of randomness that this will kind of generate. I'll just kind of straighten it out here as we look at it. You can see some stuff is disabled and enabled here because you see that this is sort of the experimentation phase. So some of it's just, back and forth. But let's look at this. So what I did was I started to kind of just cut off the top and just focus on like one half of it. And I started to do some like tiling because I wanted to figure out a way to make this render look better, and it wasn't that interesting. And there's no exact end goal in mind, so I didn't really have any limitations of, the direction I had to work in. So I started to tile it, which starts to give us sort of a nice kind of interesting pattern, I suppose, especially on the bottom. And then if we just keep going, then I did a polar distort here, which is pretty cool because then we get something really interesting where this is starting to look like an actual piece. Like we could use this for something for sure. That's what's going in my mind when I'm looking at that. Almost looks like an Eye of Sauron type of thing or something. Like you have like an eye or an iris, and of course you can control your tiles. You could just increase these or decrease these, and you're going to change your shape like this. So you start to really get into the abstract kind of style here. And so I did this multiple different ways. So I took the same render, I would stencil off the bottom, I would tile it in different ways. So I kind of took the render, flipped it over itself so you get two sides, and then tile that. And now you see we get a different result. So it's really just a combination of flipping it, tiling it, and polar distorting it. And so you get these different sort of combinations of kind of fractal-esque, I suppose. It's not completely a fractal, but this sort of style of thing. And then I just kind of started stacking these renders together. So you have stuff like this. You get these different things here. And then I had something kind of interesting here. I was like, well, that's kind of cool, but maybe, you know, we could force the perspective a little bit because, you know, it's not very thick here. You know, maybe we want to have this part be longer, like we want to be inside of a tube. So what I did was I did a polar distort again, which kind of flattens it out into texture space, and then put this onto a cylinder. And what does that do? Basically, it just puts it into sort of a three-dimensional space again. So remember, I said 2D, 3D, 2D. Now we're back in 3D again. So this is kind of interesting because we can fly a camera through this. So essentially, we get some crazy fractal stuff. And if I let this load, I was actually going to use this as part of the eye of that skull that I was showing you guys originally. Let's just let this play, and then we can kind of, let's just see if we have I think we have a video here somewhere. Yeah, I'll just load in the MP4. So we have this thing, and this is kind of the end result. So we have this cool thing where we have all these shifting motions and layers, and yeah, just from tiling renders and kind of warping them and doing different things there, it kind of salvaged that render that maybe wasn't that interesting. It was kind of interesting, but maybe it could be better, you know? So that's kind of what we get. And one thing to mention as well is, let's see, one thing I did as well, just to give a little bit of parallax, I just duplicated the sort of cylinders here, and just to give a little bit of parallax between those two shapes, which we get sort of, yeah, just a little bit more interest, I guess, in terms of the overlap between those two things. It gives it a little bit more than just like a two-dimensional feel, which is not what you want necessarily. So that's kind of the end result. And this was actually, like I said, going to be one of the eyes in that skull I showed originally. Was going to be zooming into it or something, kind of abstract art, but it ended up just looking kind of interesting as a frame. So that kind of render on the outside is, yeah, basically just what I showed. We have it here. I just did some color corrections on it. So if I just step through just a bunch of color corrections, it's a little broken here because I switched into aces, but yeah, we have just a bunch of color corrections that kind of, yeah, different areas. And the nice thing about this, by the way, is because you render it out of CG, you can control different aspects of this sort of fractal. So like if I want to control the depth and stuff like that, I have all of those extra layers that I can sort of pop out. And you see like the distance, for example, the depth pass, I could grade the back different than the foreground. So I can control that sort of effect there, which is going to look pretty cool when you're working in a sort of a fractal type of way here. So this is kind of the frame, and yeah, just frame holding at one point in time, but you could just play it through, and you're gonna have different shapes on every single frame, which gives you different stuff. And it's red here, which is different than the final result because I used it for another sort of piece that was very similar. So there was a couple of these that I was playing around with. Yeah, don't want to spend too much time on each part because the video is already gonna be pretty long. So I know I'm stepping through pretty quick here, but you know, just color corrections, hue shifts, popping out the highlights, you know, targeting some of the highlights to give a little bit more contrast. Because if you kind of do this desat thing, if you grade it, if you desaturate and you tint something, you're going to lose sort of the feeling of range. So what you want to do is kind of target the highlights and desaturate them a little bit. It'll give more of a feeling of range. It's a pretty common technique with a lot of things. So just keep that in mind. And yeah, just stepping down, more color corrections, and that's basically it for the frame. And then we can just add some little subtle glows here. So I use those sort of, I guess, the mist of lights that I had put in there as kind of lights in the frame. And that's basically it for this part. Just step down here, just see if there's anything else here. Here's an interesting part to mention. Because I'd warped this picture so many times, reprojected and done all these things, we lose a little bit of quality. We see a little bit of sort of sampling here in our kind of pattern. And I was like, well, that's not great. Like, could we make that a little bit better? And there's a tool called Topaz upscaling, and you can gigapixel, I guess the product is. So what I did was I took this render, and to fix these edges, because we've sampled it so many times and done so many crazy stuff, we can just use the AI upscaler. And essentially, it's going to give it a slight illustrative look, but we can kind of smooth out some of the edges here. And then we can kind of blend those two renders together. So at least we can get some of the detail back on the edges. Of course, our colors are changing a slight bit, I do think that this workflow will become more prominent in the future, and maybe it will maintain highlights and stuff and the colors a little bit in a more perfected way. But regardless, we still get these nice smooth edges restored here. And then we can just sort of, kind of patch that into different areas. So I kind of key mix the upscaled image into different areas. So we get some smoother edges. And I put a slight defocus as well, just to soften it, because the focus is eventually going to be kind of on the center here. So, but I just wanted to fix like the little weird sharp edges that kind of come through. So that's how you can use an AI upscaler to essentially, I don't know, it works for still images. There is a upscaler for video as well that they have. I haven't used it quite that much yet. I've been experimenting with it, but it's good to know that those workflows exist if you're ever in a sort of a problem with that. Especially if you're doing something with like a lot of texture and you need to maintain those details. So continuing through, I guess we're on to the skull part now. So this will be like the second half of the tutorial. We've covered the frame. We'll start talking about the CG in this.